And now in chapter 5 of Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology, this is the chapter covering ritual love death, which is a reference to Wagner's opera Tristan. That Tristan and Isolde, even though they are separate beings, they are made the same by the end of the opera. And of course, they both die in love and in a suicide together. And so, this is really the metaphysics of the two and the one that Campbell will go into more in creative mythology. But this idea could be applied really to the ritual love death within this chapter here. And so, the next myth that he's going to focus on for us is the descent and return of the maiden. And so, this myth in particular is originates in Ceram, or west of New Guinea. And so we have the echo to the previous myth in the Sudan, where there's the pubescent boy in Africa, where there's a kindling fire, and once that fire goes out, they're buried alive after fornication, where in this Guinea case, they choose a female and set her aside, and she's initiated with fornication with all of the men in the village. Everyone kind of has this huge orgy. And then the last boy has the sexual act with the girl. And then two large logs are set above the copulation act and are released and crushes them, all while the sounds of drums are playing. And then the couple is then consumed afterwards. And so the myth of the island west of New Guinea is given to us by the pupil of Leo Frobenius, the ethnographer Adolf Jensen. And the myth goes a little something like this. In the dream time, there are 9 families emerging out of 9 different clusters of bananas. And the main figure here is Amita, and his name means the night or the black. And the story goes of him hunting with a dog. He's out and they chase after a pig who runs into a pond. And as the dog chases the pig then drowns. And Amita retrieves the pig corpse. And attached to one of the husks of the pig, or impaled on the tusk, is a coconut. And so he takes this coconut and he puts it on a nightstand, and he applies a cloth of a serpent image over it in the over the coconut, and he goes and rests. And during his rest, he finds a confrontation with a dreamlike figure, and it comes to him and tells him to plant the coconut to grow the tree. And in 3 days, the tree sprouts up, and he decides to make a beverage out of the fibers of the tree. And so he cuts the tree, and so as he's climbing it and using the blade, he mishandles it and cuts himself. And so he bleeds down the tree, and this creates a human visage. And after another 3 days, he returns to it to see it take shape of a small female girl. And then the dream figure returns to him to tell him to take the cloth that we mentioned earlier and wrap it around the girl. So he climbs back up the tree to do this act and takes her down. And this girl ends up being his daughter, or he's the caregiver of Hanaweli, and this name has reference to the Cocoa Pond. And this girl, of course, is special. She's of the virgin deity, or lineage, if you will. And she has, of course, otherworldly properties, and most notably, her excrement is she's basically secreting out precious jewels and artifacts. And this, of course, makes Amita very rich. And there's the ceremony, a ritual in the village, where the 9 families are dancing in the ceremonial festival And typically, in most cases with this ritual, there's orientated, where there is a female who is the center dispensing of goods, or the harvest, and the men around dance in this spiral. The spiral is very important, as we'll get into. And Hanaweli this time is, of course, the center. And so she gives them things like betelment. On the second night, she dispenses coral to them. On the third, it's Chinese porcelain. On the fourth, utensils and knives. And then on fast forward to the final night, she dispenses actual gold, making giving her a sort of infamy within the village. This, of course, turns to jealousy, because, of course, she is enriching herself by being able to secrete these jewels out of her. And so they do this similar ritual, but this time in the dance ceremony around Hanaweli. They decide to shove her into a ditch and bury her alive. Now, of course, the father, Amita, he is unaware until he realizes that his daughter has gone missing and finds out that she has been murdered. And so he returns to the cocoa tree to collect more fibers to locate her. And he finds her corpse and chops her to different pieces, much like, and this is a call to Iris with Osiris, and similarly plants them in these sporadic locations to represent all of the different vegetation and variants that sustain the village and its agriculture. And so each represents a piece of her body that the tribe requires to sustain itself. And so he does the act of burying her body all over the village, except for her two arms, which are taken to the virgin goddess Satini. And in doing so, he informs her of what happened to his daughter. And so Satini is representative, or is a semiotic vacancy, as we'll get into, of the wrathful, vengeful deity. And so she is furious at the murder of the virgin-born Dema. And so she takes the two arms and she withdraws from the people, creating a special gate with 9 spirals. And you are to be judged at this gate. And so to make it through, others are then transformed into different animals. And it's a sort of creation myth here. And the ones who get through the gate are greeted with the arms to then be dispensed of separate tribes of people. And in doing so, she's setting forth the archetype of the ruling, and out of which, our patterns, our recognition, the sort of metaphysics of the tribe, if you will, are to be patterned out, and thus yearn for, to find Satini, and but in doing so, to find her, of course, is to be greeted with the kiss of death in one's death. And Campbell here is really pointing out the similarities with the humanist Mediterranean myths and this particular myth from Indonesia. And comparatively, we look at Demeter and Persephone, who Demeter is Satini compared to Hanaweli, who was married to Death's maiden. Now, in the Persephone myth, she is out gathering flowers with the young virgin daughters of Demeter, playing with the daughters of Okeanos. And, of course, Okeanos is the god or ruler of the watery circular abyss. And in that vogue really represents the underworld. And so Persephone is lured by this particular beautiful plant as they've been playing along here. And of course, this plant is a lure from Pluto or Hades. And as she's pulling on the plant, the earth opens up in a sort of chasm and comes out. And he greets her on his golden chariot driven by Hades himself. And so he, of course, takes her down to the depths of the underworld. And at the same time, a swan herd goes by, Euboleus and his pigs, who fall into the chasm as well. And in doing so, Demeter then grieves. Again, comparison here to the grieving deity we had just talked about in the Pras myth. And for 9 days, they wander and look for Persephone. And in doing so, as she comes up shorthanded, she decides to put a curse on the earth, and in doing so withdraws from Olympus to leave no vegetation left. And she is then consulted by the other gods to ask, why is she acting in such a wrathful way onto the earth by drying up all of the agriculture. And she refuses to tell until Zeus himself has to intervene. And in doing so, he makes her agree to return the earth's greenery in the act of her daughter's return from the underworld. Unfortunately, Persephone has eaten from the underworldly pomegranate, and this stands in to represent the three, for the Greeks, they acknowledge 3 seasons instead of 4. And so for a third, this represents winter, Persephone must go down to Hades, her lover, and of course in the spring and the summer she returns to the earth. We then make reference to the Prolegomena to study Greek religion by Jane Ellen Harrison, in which she describes the Themis and Thoria and is relational to Persephone and Demeter and divides to the 3 days. And so in this practice here, the first day is Cathodos and Onidos, where the pigs from last year's corpses are dug up in the chasm. And they take the corpse from the previous year, put them on the altar, and then put a herd of live pigs down into the chasm to bring up again next year in that ritual. And then they bury a bunch of cakes and offerings shaped in the motif of serpents and humans to feed as an offering for the serpents of the underworld to keep them below the earth and not intervene with the living. And of course they cover this pit as well. And so Campbell here is pointing out that both Hanaway and Persephone personifies the food that the tribe depends on, everyone consumes. And so the primordial god that gave itself up in the beginning of these myths, in the sacrifice, Persephone, and the upholding of the stock of grain, she is the goddess who lives in the grain. And of course this is going to be used and is an echo really to what becomes of Christianity and the wheat, which is elevated in the host of the communion. And so Campbell also points out that we see why the pigs are thrown down, and the mimic of the human and serpents of flower creation, which represents the sacrifice, in this case with the pigs and the flower, or the flower that represents humans, to please Persephone. And so Campbell actually says that, and you've noticed here where the serpent in these myths here, Campbell believes that they actually, at one point, the serpent could have represented Hades himself, but as over times the semiotics, rotate and move and complement the milieus of that tribe or that territory. And so Campbell believes that the serpent used to have a much more integral part of the myths, as we've seen in these last 2 here. I think he goes this way because, of course, Okeanos represents the watery abyss, even though he plays a small role. It is an important detail, though, that there's this serpent imagery, there's this mention of the Okeanos watery abyss, and the serpent deity, and this really the callback. And when we look at the Regicide myth in the previous chapters, where the king's court is killed and are eventually replaced with figurines in the first dynasty, you had the expansion really of this really machinic-like assembly of the ritual of the kingly sacrifices. It just kept expanding and expanding to the point where it just didn't seem very practical, really, at some point, to where an entire court of kings and all of his relations are to be sacrificed every single time there is a change, or of course in that myth and that region it was to do with the planetary alignment. So Campbell is really making reference here, or wants to shed light on how when myths are introduced to new territories, they take on different properties to accentuate in the storytelling of that region. So perhaps the serpent played the role of the pig in the prior Indonesia myth, where the coconut was discovered. In the Polynesian myth we'll get into later in this video, it is of an eel instead of a serpent. And, in that region, serpents are largely just, they don't really exist in that region of the world. So the eel is introduced. It really rubs up against one of the main central ideas for Campbell and really in this book, because Campbell believes people are always on the move, taking myths and adapting to the local milieus around them. And so, in this middle stage of the book here, and he has some interesting other comparisons here, where the numbers from 1 to 10 are the same in Madagascar through Indonesia to Polynesia. There's, very little leeway between them in their phonemes. And this is really concrete evidence of, and we saw the number affiliation with, 3, 9. He does this again with chickens in this cultural zone, and even though he does take the unconscious seriously in that Jungian sense, he is very much into the concrete and really, as an American, these sort of pragmatic observations of, many times there is a historical placement, if you will, for how these myths are actually moving around the world in the cultural diffusion idea. And this thesis idea of the cultural circle, starting with the Sudan, and it moves to Indonesia with West Saram, before you then go to the Polynesian eel story and continue across the Pacific to eventually the New World. And so the mythology of the planters is this unified idea of Frobenius, of the cultural circle, which notice prior that the sphere goes from West Africa through the Ecuadorian jungles, through East Africa, across the water to Madagascar, India, and to Melanesia, Polynesia, and onto the New World with the primary myth of human sacrifice of the being who represents the incarnation of the divine act in the origin of the dream time to the food plant that our lives, or at least the community that it is being passed on to, depend on. And in doing so, in that act, the being is cut up and feasted upon in order to sustain the rest of the people in sustenance. So Campbell is very different from the Jungian ideas here of just the a priori way in which he talked about art earlier in the book, because he thinks this transfusion of these myths we see linking from all the way to the Chinese dynasties to the New World. There's, of course, totem poles in Africa to China, and begs the question, really, and Campbell actually posits that he really doesn't know. I don't think anyone truly knows, even though we do have more up-to-date archaeology than Campbell has to offer in this book. There isn't a certainty on the diffusion of how these myths were descended onto the tropics in this process. Did they come from the northern Palestinian, Syria, Iraq sort of way, descended down onto the tropics? or did these myths originate in the tropics? Because of course we don't really have the historical necessity and concrete evidence that we do have in the north with the use of mud bricks and stones. The tropics, of course, everything just simply grows and withers, and you don't have these perishable materials that can stand through the local conditions, if you will, and give this sort of concrete visibility that we seem to have in the north. And so no one's really too sure about that, although it does seem that as far back as 8000 BC in the Syria, Iraq, Palestine area, if you will, it does seem that human sacrifice started there and diffused in a southern trajectory to the tropics. That seems to be the best bet, at least as we've been looking in recent times. Doing so, we then turn to the next Polynesian myth of the story of the eel. And again, we're examining this cultural diffusing process of the killed sacrifice, which is then cut up and then diffused among the village to sustain itself. And so this Polynesian triangle goes from Hawaii to the Easter Islands and then down to New Zealand. And as mentioned earlier, snakes, or the serpent, is a foreign concept because they're so rare. In fact, they don't seem to appear at all. And so the mythological protagonist or land naming with semiotics that have to be filled with the nearest equal represented by the eel instead of the snake here. And so as this myth goes, Hina, who lives below the ocean, and tuna, the name signifies, of course, there's a lot of phallic and really erotic imagery in this myth in particular. And then you have the relationship with Maui, who represents the cosmic creator of the wonder deeds. And so the myth opens with Hina, who is with this monster eel, tuna, and she tells him he will forage for food and will return in a few days. And by the third day, Tuna says, take as long as you want. And in this meantime, she's, of course, traveling to find a new lover. And so she goes and finds this clan of men and gives a speech to find a new husband. But no one wants to stand up to Tuna. And so she then goes to another clan, the Penetration clan. And like I said, there's a ton of erotic imagery here. So she gives the same speech with and doing so in kind, the similar response. And then she goes to the Erect clan. And in the same way, she ends up empty-handed without a husband. And then she goes to the Wonder Working clan, which is, of course, where Maui hears this speech. And so he's up for the challenge. And so Maui lives with his mother, who says that he should marry Hina and advises him to steal her from Tuna. And so word then spreads about Tuna's wife being taken. He starts off largely with indifference. He doesn't really care. He thinks that things are better without her, actually. But of course, people have to poke fun at him. They're disrespectful of the fact that he had his wife commit sort of infidelity. So as the days pass, he starts stewing, and so he's mocked, and then he asks, what is this Maui like? What's so great about him? And he's described as this scrawny and small, and there's actually this rumor that he has a lopsided phallus. So Tuna then delivers this message that he is going to come and hunt down Maui. So Maui is told of this, but Maui doesn't plan on backing down, of course. And so despite the fear of Tuna, he then arrives with a huge hurricane-like storm behind him. And he's bringing a whole gang of monsters with him. And again, there's this phallic imagery of companions, and they're named interesting things like scrotum. Maui, to ward off the storm, is told to expose himself, and in doing so, and showing his eccentric phallus, the storm recedes, and the water not just recedes back, but actually dries up, and all of Tuna's henchmen die, except Tuna, who is given mercy, who is then offered a place to stay, and Tuna takes this up reluctantly, and the four live together for a short period of time before Tuna, again, his jealousy or his yearning for a sort of retribution provokes him to challenge Maui to a duel. And this duel is a sort of miniaturization against each other, where one miniaturizes and is put into the body of the other one, and whoever survives the act of doing so can have Hina. And so they agree to this duel, and so Tuna shrinks and goes inside Maui, but nothing really happens. Tuna returns to normal, and he's left still standing. Maui then returns the favor, shrinks down, and Tuna then just erupts into all of these different pieces, and his head in particular is then taken by Maui, and he wants to give it, I think, to his grandfather, but his mother intervenes and says that he should actually plant the head of Tuna in the corner of their living quarters. And so from this burial spot, is out of his head, is the first growings of the first world coconut palm that emerges out of it. And so again, in comparative mythology here, we see the myth again of the killed, cut up being the primary food sustenance for the community. And so Campbell wants to talk of the parallels. There's just too many for Campbell to not see this sort of diffusion here. And he has a lot of different dates that he talks about here, and the arrival of agriculture, even though I do believe that these dates now are actually no longer apply to contemporary archaeology. And then he looks at some of these other myths of the diffusion process, such as the recountings of some of these smaller myths in the Great Lakes by the ethnographer Henry Schoolcraft. This one is the legend of the Madonnan, or the origin of Indian corn, and is the story of a boy with a very poor father who reaches the pubescent stage and goes on a shamanic vision quest. You're seeing a sort of a synthesis of what we'll get into with the northern idea of the shaman vision quest, meeting up here with the Ecuadorian, sacrifice and agriculture motif. And so the boy is doing this, ritualistic fast in a hut, and he has this vision of a spirit being a man spirit who comes from the heavens with a green and yellow outfit, and he asks to dualistically wrestle with the boy. And the first night they end in a deadlock, a sort of tie. The second day they have another draw, and again, but on the third day, one's WUNZH, best the spirit being, and the vision quest says one more fight, and he must be stripped of his clothing and buried, or at least that is the ask of the deity here when he is defeated. And so the boy continues his fasting and defers sustenance, and the spirit being returns for the fourth time, and one's is again victorious, and so he smooths away the earth down with this sort of grave, and as he visits the gravesite and progresses along, this plant, or the first maize corn plant, arises out of the burial site. Then is going to turn to the South American example with the singing boy in the Colombian, or modern day Colombia, and this boy comes down from the sun, and he has this beautiful song that he can always tap into to sing, and it's so beautiful that it's destructive. It'll destroy and kill anything that actually hears it. And so the boy, being too dangerous, is burned to death in a sort of pyre. And as he is being burned alive, he still is singing his tune. And in doing so, he ascends to heaven, but his ashes create the new palm from the roots, which then can be used to create music. These are very musical orientated people. And then Campbell turns to another small myth of the Aztec ritual, where the Aztec finds the goddess Chico, and they decorate her with beads and corn cobs and a bunch of colorful peppers and vegetation. And so they carry her around and elevate her, and they have a sort of stand-in wooden maze statue, and they light incense, and they tilt her back, and they cut her head off with a sort of obsidian knife, and they have a bowl placed underneath this sacrifice to catch the blood, and then the blood is to be used to sprinkle all over the festive crops. Then the headless body is filleted, and where the high priest wears the skin of the girl and their clothing, and acts as a sort of arbiter of the resurrected maize goddess. And so, with this myth, Campbell concludes that the Aztec creation of the girl torn apart in the creation of the mountains, seas, it's a sort of creation myth, and yearns for the human blood and hearts. And in Aztec rituals, you see the removal of hearts many times, and the use of blood as a sacrifice. And without it, we will not have proper crops because of this sacrifice that must be given. And so really, Campbell is saying, and in ending here, the central thesis is the killed plant god who personifies as if the human was contained inside the deity. And then they offer themselves up to then be taken into the sustenance and nourishment that unites us all together. And of course, Campbell is pointing this all out because, of course, with Christianity, with the Mass, you have the bread and wine of Christ, which uses the semiotic vacancies, as we've looked at some of the other myths when they're met up with this humanistic sort of aspect to it, and the changing of traditions, where you will have a sort of stand-in for what once stood for the actual human sacrifices that we've been looking at since the days of the Sudan here. And so that's going to really wrap up this really long, lengthy chapter on chapter 5. And this really rounds the discussions of the first half of the book. The second half is going to be facing towards the understanding of the North and the shamanic vision quest motif in comparison to the Ecuadorian jungles that we've been talking about in the cultural zone and diffusion here. And if you guys like this video and want to see more, make sure to comment, like, and subscribe. And I hope you guys enjoy it.